felt sensible. But another part urged the proto-dragon on. Malygos recalled what Koros had said about Galakrond. If Koros had come this far, he would not stop until he achieved his goal. And if that happened, the other proto-dragons would become easy prey for Galakrond and his new followers. Malygos flew low and fast, eyes now seeking any object in the sky. Aware of how swiftly Galakrond himself could fly, Malygos knew that he would have very little chance of escape should the gargantuan proto-dragon spot him. Everything Malygos planned revolved around seeing the behemoth first. Kalek searched his host's mind for details of what he planned, and quickly discovered that Malygos's strategy consisted mostly of finding Galakrond and taking it from there. While Kalek was well aware of how adaptable the future Spellweaver could be, seeking out the monster terrorizing the land was, to the Blue Dragon, insane. However, as always, the choice was not Kalek's. He could only pray that history would be as he recalled it, and he was questioning those recollections more and more with each vision, and that Malygos would survive. Survival instinct did not seem a trait of his host, as the proto-dragon pushed harder and harder, almost as if eager to confront Galakrond face to face. The landscape changed more than once as Malygos followed the behemoth's odd and unnerving scent. In addition, the fresher the trail, the more Malygos began to notice the wrongness in that scent. There was a sense of decay, as if Galakrond himself were dead and yet was not. Moreover, there was something else inherent in the scent that to the proto-dragon felt twisted, frightening. Evil was not a concept understood much by Malygos's race, but Kalek recognized that it was that very notion that his host sought. Whatever Galakrond had once been, and Malygos's memories indicated a past in which the Leviathan had been thought of as almost benevolent, he had crossed to a darker path at some point. Much like Deathwing, Kalek thought with growing horror, but in some ways worse and more primal. Why this had never been passed on to the Blue's own kind plagued Kalek despite his own trials. What had made the original aspects and the other first dragons agree to keep this terrible era a secret from the generations to come? Malygos came to a sudden halt. Kalek belatedly sensed that mixed in with Galakrond's ever-fresher scent was a trace of another scent Malygos recognized. Not Koros, but one of those with him. The blue and white proto-dragon banked, following that scent. Although the essence of Galakrond still prevailed, the other scent began to take on more freshness. Other smells joined it, among them Koros's. Then another, fouler odor caught Malygos's attention. He immediately descended. A pair of undead proto-dragons dropped down from high above. Their claws just missed rending Malygos's wings. With ragged hisses, they pursued him to the ground. Through his host's eyes, Kalek sought out some place from which to better defend himself, only to bitterly recall that he was not in command of the body he inhabited. Had he been, a natural stone arch to the west would have been his choice of destination. Malygos headed for the arch. Kalek could not be at all certain whether Malygos had made the same choice on his own, or whether the proto-dragon and he somehow had been for a moment as one. Kalek settled for hoping that the arch would prove the correct decision. The two undead were right on their tail and gaining. Malygos darted through the arch, then immediately rose. Spinning in the air, the proto-dragon landed hard, paws first, on the arch. Kalek felt every bone shake from the impact, and hoped that his host had not badly injured himself. The arch collapsed. Tons of rock rained down as the two undead, relentlessly pursuing, passed underneath. The rubble pressed the foremost pursuer to the ground below, where it reduced the corpse to pulp. The collapse did not entirely catch the second undead, but it did throw the fiend out of control. The animated corpse crashed into one of the fragmented arch walls.
Time is money.
Already inhaling, Malagos dived after his pursuer. As the undead attempted to right itself, Malagos unleashed the frost.
What's up?
The undead's movements slowed. Malagos increased his velocity. He tore into the fiend before it could recover from the blast, biting into the throat and tearing at the chest. The dry scale and flesh gave way easily, but that did not mean that the corpse ceased its assault on Malagos. The effects of the frost faded. Even with its throat nearly torn out, the undead tried to bite into Malagos's wing. Claws sought his own throat. Thrusting his head into the chest cavity, the proto-dragon clamped down and ripped out everything he could. As he pulled out, the upper part of the body collapsed into the ruined chest. The undead's flailing head snapped up. Malagos finished decapitating the creature, letting the head fall to the side. The ravaged body continued awkwardly seeking him. The proto-dragon shifted, and the body stumbled past. But as Malagos did that, a sharp pain coursed through his left hind paw. He roared in anguish as he fought to shake free the tightened jaws of the head. Blood poured from where several teeth had punctured the proto-dragon's hide. Seizing the jaws, Malagos finally pried them loose. He threw the head as far away as he could. His injured paw throbbed. Blood continued to flow. Malagos studied the wounds, then carefully exhaled. A finer stream of frost blanketed the injured area. The coolness eased the throbbing and helped slow the blood flow, which finally stopped on its own a few moments later. Kalek felt the pain every bit as much as Malagos did. As it was, he was grateful for whatever the coolness did to ease matters. The wind coursed through the region. Malagos sniffed the air. Both noted the clear scent of Koros and some of his followers. Why they had diverged from their pursuit of Galakrond, neither Kalek nor his host could say, but the two were of one mind in wanting to find out. Not desiring to fall prey to another trap, Malagos took a circuitous route that also prevented his own scent from drifting back to his enemies. As the proto-dragon neared, a new, very powerful scent joined that of Koros and the others. The scent of blood. Very fresh blood. That disturbing scent was followed by the snarling voice of Koros. What the other proto-dragon said was not clear, but he was obviously angry. With great caution, Malagos peered around the rocks. His eyes widened. Koros and his followers were not alone. Between them lay a juvenile male of Alexstrasza's family. There were also two more members of Koros's family, one of them a female slightly smaller than the group's leader. She had a look of sly pride on her countenance that appeared to both Malagos and Kalek to have nothing to do with Koros's anger, which was evidently focused on two of the other males. "Do it," their leader growled. "Must be done this way. Galakrond did it this way." The juvenile tried to rise, then slumped. His savage wounds now revealed themselves. His chest had been torn open and his wings ripped apart. Malagos's gaze shifted to the new pair, where he saw that both had claws stained crimson. "Brought him here for you," interjected the female, taking up Koros's cause. "Now eat." Malagos recoiled, and if Kalek could have done the same, he would have. Neither could believe what he had heard. The other proto-dragons remained hesitant. The female looked at Koros, who hissed. In doing so, Koros revealed that his teeth were as red as her claws. Without warning, she lunged at the wounded juvenile's throat. As the other males, except for Koros, recoiled with as much shock as Malagos had, the female ripped out a monstrous chunk of flesh from his side. With great gusto, she tossed it up, then let it fall into a gullet. She swallowed it whole and sneered at the rest of the party. Malagos wanted to go to the aid of the juvenile, but knew not only that it was already too late, but also that he would simply be throwing his own life away. Kalek understood that, but suddenly wished that he stood beside his host. The two of them together could have taken Koros and his party. Of that he was certain. And yet he could do nothing more than Malagos, who shared his frustration and horror at watching the butchery. One of the hesitant males finally lunged. He ripped a mass of flesh from one of the juvenile's arms. As he swallowed it, the rest finally joined in. The feast proved too much even for the stalwart Malagos. He turned away and quietly retched. Kalek experienced every raw emotion as Malagos fought to come to grips with the atrocity Koros had led his followers to perpetrate. Proto-dragons did not devour proto-dragons. Yes, they tasted the blood of their rivals in duels, but even when a duel ended in death, it did not continue with the consuming of the dead. Not, at least, until Galakrond. Malagos stiffened. Galakrond. Neither Kalek nor his host could have imagined the situation worse than it was, but now it came to both of them that what Koros intended was for him and his followers to become like Galakrond. Shuddering, Malagos forced his gaze back to the scene. The fire-orange juvenile had mercifully died and no longer suffered as bite after bite was ripped from him. Koros's followers quickly left little beyond bones and torn skin. It was Koros who brought an end to the hideous tableau. Muzzle soaked, he raised the ruined head by the jaw and tossed it aside. Done. All done. We grow stronger. We see it soon. Soon, the female echoed. Soon, the others repeated. Koros stretched his wings. Now you see how Galakrond will not eat us. We are like Galakrond. We will be with him. He will not eat us now. This encouraged even the most reluctant of his followers. The gathered proto-dragons raised their heads and hissed as one. Koros then took off, the female immediately joining him. The rest followed, leaving in their windy wake the jumbled remains of their victim. Malagos almost gave chase, but suddenly found himself drawn to the ravaged corpse. The pungent odor of a fresh kill filled his nostrils. For reasons clear to neither Malagos nor Kalek, the proto-dragon bent to investigate the grisly pile. Kalek's host sniffed the juvenile's remains, and then, on impulse, seized one of the bones in his jaws. Barely had Malagos done so than the proto-dragon spit the bone out. Even then, though, there was a desire to take it or another piece and work what fragments of meat remained off of it and into his gullet. Both Kalek and his host recoiled at the idea, yet Malagos had to fight hard to pull back from the corpse. Hunger filled him, a hunger that revolved around more than merely the eating of flesh. Malagos yearned to taste something else, something that Kalek first recognized. Malagos hungers for the juvenile's lingering life essence. The blue dragon could feel the proto-dragon straining not to tear at the remnants in search of what little had not faded away. Stifling a roar of anger, Malagos turned and flew from the spot. At first he simply flew as far as he could from the corpse, even though that took him in the wrong direction. Only after the wind in his face cooled Malagos enough did the proto-dragon finally arc back toward the path Koros's band had taken. Their scents were strong, but both Malagos and Kalek noted something different. A hint of the wrongness that pervaded wherever Galakrond flew now tinged their spoor. It stirred the disquieting desire in Malagos again, but Kalek's host fought it down, although the strain was greater this time. Malagos picked up his pace. Kalek understood that the proto-dragon still did not know what he would do, but he at least had to find out what happened when Koros made his offer to Galakrond. Images of Koros leading the other proto-dragons into a trap where Galakrond would then devour them all flashed through Malagos's and also Kalek's mind over and over. A flash of blue-green below caught Malagos's attention. The sharp-eyed proto-dragon spotted movement near a small creek. While Kalek tried to make sense of what his host saw, Malagos landed a short distance away from what he had seen. A rasping sound echoed from ahead. Malagos crept toward it. Something gulped a great amount of water. Seconds later, Kalek saw through Malagos's eyes the familiar figure of one of Koros's family. While Kalek had no idea which of the band this was, his host recognized the male as among those most hesitant to partake of the gruesome repast. The other proto-dragon did not look very well. His eyes had turned a pale yellow, and his breathing was ragged. He swallowed another mouthful of water, then coughed up half of it, along with some undigested flesh. Malagos's stomach churned in turn. Perhaps he made some noise or movement that neither he nor Kalek noticed, for suddenly the other male whirled in his direction. With a savage hiss, the blue-green proto-dragon lunged at Malagos. The sickened male moved with a speed his condition belied, falling upon Malagos. Kalek's host barely pulled back enough to keep from having his throat ripped out. His attacker fought with an almost mindless fury that more than made up for any cunning. The slavering maw seemed everywhere. How Malagos managed to avoid being slaughtered neither Kalek nor his host could fathom, and yet the icy blue male succeeded, if barely. Within seconds, Malagos sported a half-dozen slashes, fortunately none of them more than superficial. But the number of wounds and the strain of the struggle began to stir anew the throbbing where the undead had bitten Malagos. The proto-dragon's head pounded. Kalek felt the intelligent, adaptable Malagos give way to a beast as unthinking as the one that attacked him. A beast that struck with more rage than the sickened male. Now it was Malagos who bit and tore and ripped mercilessly. His great hind claws cut deep scarlet ribbons in his opponent's hide. His smaller forepaws clung tightly to the other male, keeping Malagos's foe where he desired him. Even when the second male finally began to try to pull away, Malagos gave no quarter. Kalek could only watch in growing dread as his host fell upon his weakening adversary. Spittle dripped from Malagos's jaws as he loomed over the other proto-dragon. Malagos was eager for the kill, eager for that, and for something else that Kalek only now recognized, but could not stop. With one last lunge, Malagos bit through his opponent's throat, tearing off almost half of it in his frenzy. Yet he did not simply toss it aside, as Kalek hoped. but rather eagerly threw it above his head in order to swallow it. However, as he caught it in his gullet, Malagos came to his senses. Hacking, Kalek's host disgorged the gobbet of flesh. The proto-dragon stumbled back, as dismayed as Kalek at what he had been about to do. The bite from the undead pounded harder than ever. Malagos glared at it, then stared wide-eyed. Within, Kalek also realized what had overcome his host.
See you around.
The bite had infected Malagos, urged him toward the same foul course that Galakrond followed, the same course that Koros now also desired to pursue. And although Malagos continued to fight the desire, it remained strong. The nearby body, still fresh, radiated traces of the victim's life essence, which continuously enticed the proto-dragon. With an anxious hiss, Malagos launched himself after Koros again. The proto-dragon concentrated as hard as he could on his rival and the expected encounter with Galakrond. Malagos dared not think of anything else. But Kalek was thinking long and hard, making a further connection that his host had not. A single bite had nearly driven Malagos beyond saving. How many other proto-dragons had been bitten? How many others would be? And how many of those bitten would fail to fight off the effects as Malagos had done so far, paving the way for a tableau of horror even greater than Koros's betrayal portended? Two, the betrayers. Time had come to have little meaning for Kalek anymore. At least, the more he remained caught up in the past. Indeed, as things progressed here, he felt less inclined to return to his own era. Even though he was but an unnoticed, incorporeal companion to the young Malagos, Kalek could not help but feel as if, in some ways, he now had more purpose here. He experienced all Malagos did, both good or ill, and the two progressively appeared in harmony when it came to the proto-dragon's course of action. We are becoming one, Kalek finally decided, as Galakrond's growing stench gave every evidence of the gargantuan beast's nearing presence. Not at all disturbed by the esoteric path his thoughts were taking, Kalek urged Malagos to use greater speed, and Malagos did just that. Yet with Kalek's increasing satisfaction at his growing part in these visions, there also came the determination that Galakrond and the corruption he spread had to be stopped. Kalek no longer felt certain just how the future was supposed to turn out. It was possible that the Azeroth he knew was only a delusion of his own mind. Galakrond must be stopped, Kalek kept insisting to himself, that mission more real to him at the moment than his own life. Galakrond and Koros. Malagos suddenly dived for the ground. At the same time, through his eyes, Kalek caught a glimpse of Koros and the others rising higher into the sky just ahead. Kalek could only assume that the band had paused for some reason before continuing on. And even though Malagos reacted quickly, the female with Koros turned her head back as if sensing something. Belatedly, both Kalek and his host realized that she looked for the missing member of their party. Unfortunately, instead, she had discovered their lone pursuer. There was no need to hear the sharp cry to know that she warned Koros and the rest. Malagos continued to descend until he was just feet above the ground. The tips of his wings scraped the rough soil more than once as he sought out some cover. He darted through a narrow pass, gaze constantly judging which of the various pathways ahead might be the best. He veered through one after another, risking a glance back and above whenever it was safe for even a moment to do so. And so he did not see Koros come at him from around the next bend. The other proto-dragon rammed into Malygos. The pair crashed into one of the rock walls. Malygos gasped as the air was forced from his lungs. He tried to regain his breath, but Koros shoved his hind paws deep, keeping Kalek's host from inhaling. A second attacker, the female, dropped down on Malygos, pushing him to the ground. She and Koros sought his throat. The land shook. Rock and earth tumbled down on the three. Malygos, nearly on his back, received the brunt of the collapse. Koros and the female thrust themselves away, vanishing behind the falling debris. A heavy rock pinned Malygos's wing. He struggled at first, then swung his body over the trapped appendage. The pain in twisting shook Kalek and his host hard, but it enabled the proto-dragon finally to slide the rock off, despite the continued deluge. It seemed forever before Malygos managed to draw a breath, even if it was filled with dust that made him choke. Malygos immediately exhaled, sending a strong wave of frost above him. It slowed the collapse, giving him a few vital seconds to cover himself better with his wings and take another breath. The collapse at last ended. Malygos struggled to free himself, but at first could barely breathe, much less move. The frost he had exhaled had begun to break up, and more rock threatened to come down. It was clear to both that they needed to push free fast. While Malygos's forepaws were small in comparison with the hind ones, they still had strength enough to help him claw forward until his larger appendages could better push him on. With his snout, the proto-dragon shoved the rocks ahead. The stones shifted around him. He managed to shove another rock aside, and a puff of air touched his nostrils. With more effort, Malygos kicked himself toward the small gap. His head thrust through, and for a moment he hesitated, certain that Koros was waiting for just this to happen. But when his rival did not snap his head off, Malygos dug himself out the rest of the way. His wing now vied with his leg, for which pained him more, but a short test proved the former was still functional. The collapse had left his hearing all but gone for the time being. He could not make any sense of what was happening, except what he saw and felt, which was more than enough, considering the second tremor that forced him to retreat from his location. As Malygos paused again, his hearing slowly returned. Both he and Kalek heard what sounded their thunder or another tremor beginning, only to realize that instead they were hearing the wary rumble of a very large creature. It was then that Kalek and his host understood that what they had both taken for the shifting of the ground had been the simple landing of Galakrond. With the utmost caution, Malygos wended his way up. He could hear another voice then, the voice of Koros. "Many will be there, all waiting like grazers to be eaten. So very many." Each word Galakrond spoke reverberated in Malygos's still tender ears. It was doubtful to both him and Kalek that Galakrond could speak at anything less than a roar. "We will feast well," Koros assured him. "We will grow strong." Malygos carefully poked his head over the edge. Koros obviously assumed that he was buried beneath tons of rubble, but the icy blue proto-dragon remained wary of sentinels arranged just in case some other foolish creature dared spy on Galakrond. Indeed, through his host, Kalek observed at least one of Koros's band clearly acting as a lookout, although fortunately not glancing Malagos's way at that moment. Koros and the female hovered before Galakrond, who appeared larger than ever to Malagos and Kalek. Even more disturbing was that the various protuberances pockmarking the behemoth's skin were more distinct than before. Full limbs dangled everywhere. There were even wings that fruitlessly flapped, as if seeking to lift Galakrond in the air. But most disturbing were the eyes. Scattered about, the singular orbs stared with the same malevolent intent as the two original ones now fixed upon Koros and the female. The scores of extra eyes blinked randomly, as if each was from an individual and not part of the same beast. One of the nearest turned its baleful gaze toward Malagos. He ducked immediately. The icy blue male held his breath and waited. There was no outcry from Galakrond, though. The only sounds were the voices of Koros and the female. Still full of trepidation, Malagos raised his head again. The eye now looked past him to the small band facing the gargantuan fiend. "Great Galakrond will lead us," Koros continued almost gleefully. "Great Galakrond will rule all!" This Koros is mad, Kalek thought, well aware that Malagos thought the same of his rival. Still, they both saw that Galakrond listened with interest to the words. "Where will they gather?" Galakrond finally asked Koros. "The Jagged Valley. Soon." Although Kalek did not recognize the description, Malagos evidently did. His low hiss marked the truth of Koros's words and the depths of the other proto-dragon's betrayal.
"Beware."
"I know this place," Galakrond remarked, his gaze looking inward. "Hunted there when I was small, when I was nothing." "But you are great now," said the female, the others adding their agreement with a chorus of hisses. Some of the vestigial limbs twitched, paws snatching as if seeking prey. Several more of the eyes followed Galakrond's gaze. "Great I am," the gigantic fiend rumbled. He studied Koros in particular. "You would be great, too." "Not so great as Galakrond," Malagos's rival immediately replied, as the female swiftly nodded her agreement. "Not so great as Galakrond." "No, never so great as me." Galakrond stretched his wings, which quickly shadowed the land for some distance. One forepaw, small in comparison with the rest of him, but far larger than the full form of any normal proto-dragon, scraped at the hard ground, ripping through stone as if it were sand. "There can be only one me." An unsettled expression fell over the lookout's countenance. He suddenly took to the sky. Malagos and Kalek both believed that they had been discovered, but instead, the lookout continued higher and higher as fast as he could. There was no doubt now that he was abandoning the others. The fleeing proto-dragon raced off, vanishing into the distance. And at the same time, Galakrond roared and rose into the air just above Koros and the rest of his band. Koros and the female leapt back as the darkness that Galakrond's vast shape created now enshrouded them. The remaining two members of Koros's band sought escape, but in doing so only drew Galakrond's attention to them. Despite the speed with which they flew, it was easy for the behemoth to catch up to them. The smaller proto-dragons separated, but even that was not good enough. As Galakrond banked toward one, he brought his wing around. The massive appendage swept up the second of Koros's followers. Koros and the female took flight, heading over where Malygos hid. In their haste, they did not notice Malygos, who remained flattened against the shielding ground. Shrieks filled the air. Malygos dared to peer over. The proto-dragon caught up in Galakrond's wing had now been tossed up before him. With an eager roar, Galakrond swallowed his victim. The monstrous proto-dragon's remaining prey used his comrade's doom to try to slip past the Leviathan. He darted to the left side of Galakrond's head and continued to the shoulder. One of the extra limbs seized the fleeing proto-dragon's wing. The male let out a frightened squawk as the paw held him. Galakrond shook, letting the paw toss its victim forward. The shrieking male vanished down Galakrond's gullet. Barely had the monster finished when he veered toward Malygos. Kalek felt the urge to seek escape fill his host, but somehow Malygos kept his position. The wisdom of that decision revealed itself a moment later as Galakrond soared over and past him. The ease with which the gigantic proto-dragon had taken his other prey meant that neither Koros nor the female had gotten very far. Kalek and his host could still make out both tinier proto-dragons desperately trying to keep the gap between Galakrond and them from closing. However, a few flaps of Galakrond's wings brought him right behind the pair. Without warning, Koros rammed the female in the side. She lost control, her speed faltering in the process. He's sacrificing her for his own hide, Kalek realized. Both he and Malygos stunned at the betrayal. The female righted herself just in time to see Galakrond almost upon her. In desperation, she exhaled. However, what worked well against a foe the size of Malygos only futilely draped one of the behemoth's huge yellowed fangs. Galakrond swallowed her without even slowing in his pursuit of Koros. Malygos' rival strained to keep ahead, but even his treachery with his own family could not keep him from Galakrond's endless hunger. The mighty jaws opened wider. In what seemed madness to the onlookers, Koros abruptly turned directly toward the gaping maw. But before the jaws could shut, Koros darted up and attacked the underside of Galakrond's mouth. Claws tore at the softer, unprotected flesh. Galakrond reared back. Neither Malygos nor Kalek believed that Koros had actually hurt Galakrond, but the attack had certainly caught him by surprise. Koros used that surprise to begin his flight anew. With a swiftness that even Malygos could not have matched, the blue-green dived toward the ground, where he maintained his tremendous velocity despite having to navigate one change in terrain after another. Galakrond pursued. Malygos finally rose from his hiding place, which gave him one last glimpse of hunter and prey. And in that moment, he and Kalek both saw that despite Koros' cunning, Malygos' rival could not escape. Keeping low briefly kept Galakrond from easily snapping him up, but a rise in the land finally forced the speeding Koros to overestimate his path. Momentum sent him high above the security of the ground, and the Leviathan swallowed him whole. The abruptness with which Malygos' rival perished did not in the least disturb Kalek's host. Both had seen that all that mattered to Koros in the end was his own existence, not even that of those closest to him. Malagos's only concern was that Galakrond would suddenly turn about and spot him before he could make his escape. Fortunately, Galakrond instead alighted in a vast plain farther ahead. The macabre behemoth landed with as heavy a thud as earlier, sending a tremor through the region. Quickly descending again, Malagos waited. Galakrond settled his head on the ground. A few moments later, a low, steady rumble escaped the enormous proto-dragon. When the rumble continued, Malagos dared to take off again. How long Galakrond would rest, neither Kalak nor Malagos could guess, but the icy blue proto-dragon could not assume that he would have much time. Following Koros's tactics, Malagos kept low as he flew with as much speed as he could muster. Even when the rumbling faded into the distance, Kalak's host did not slow. One notion began dominating the proto-dragon's thoughts, and thus Kalak's. While Koros had paid for his betrayals, he had still in the end performed one more misdeed. Galakrond knew where Talanixa had the others gathering for her charge. As suicidal as the female's plan seemed to both Malagos and Kalak, at least it offered some chance. However, if Galakrond struck while they were still coming together, there would be utter disaster. The proto-dragon pushed harder. If Malagos could warn Talanixa before Galakrond awoke, and if he could make the female listen, then there was hope. Renewed rumblings sent Malagos dropping, but almost immediately he recognized the sound as thunder, not Galakrond. The exhausted proto-dragon finally paused in his flight. The effort thus far had taken a lot out of even the sturdy Malagos. It started to rain. The storm was not a strong one, but there was the fear that if the rain continued on its present course, it would soon reach Galakrond. If it woke him, he might decide to fly in Malagos's direction. Kalak's world turned upside down. The vertigo struck him as if he were experiencing it for the first time. To his surprise, the blue dragon found himself struggling to remain with his host. He could identify with this battle for survival more than with the growing number of questions that represented his existence in the present. And yet, as ever, Kalak had no choice. Malagos and the past vanished, and Kalak awoke on his back and in half-elven form, somewhere in the Nexus. There was no immediate hint to how much time, if any, had passed. It was dark, and that also disturbed Kalak, since there should have been some illumination. Rising from the floor, he summoned a sphere of light. He bared his teeth in frustration as he discovered that his surroundings were not where he had last been standing, but rather a chamber deeper in the Nexus. He looked around, seeing nothing but emptiness. Even the artifact was nowhere to be seen. Not that the fact encouraged him at all. By this point he knew that it mattered not where the physical form of the relic sat. Its power could reach him anywhere. Kalak spun around. For a moment, for just the briefest of moments, he thought that someone had been standing behind him. Someone wearing a voluminous cloak and hood. But a short search of the passage in that direction revealed nothing. Still, Kalak found himself drawn that way and continued on. As he moved, the former aspect wished that somehow he could just return to the young Malagos. Better the sanity that the madness of the past brought him than the madness his own era offered. Yet despite his growing willingness to accept what the artifact appeared to be demanding of him, he remained conscious. His disappointment was magnified by the fact that he was nearing his original location without having discovered any reason for the feeling that he had again been watched. But just before he would have entered, he sensed the presence of another. Whoever he was kept himself well cloaked from most Magi's abilities, but not Kalek's yet considerable powers. He could not tell who or what had invaded the Nexus, but the intruder was very near. Kalek dismissed the sphere, then cautiously proceeded. A faint illumination immediately spread through the area around him. It was a sign that the Nexus still responded readily to his will, which gave him a formidable line of attack. Any thief seeking the Nexus's collection would soon rue the day. Shadows filled the great chamber, which seemed natural considering the faint illumination remaining, but there was a very slight wrongness to one area that made him wary. "Kalek? Are you there?" As the voice echoed through the chamber, the wrongness vanished. Instead, the Nexus alerted him to the obvious fact that someone he knew very well now called to him from the more accepted entrance to his sanctum. Someone who was none other than Jaina Proudmoore. He turned just as she entered. Jaina did not see him at first, but when she did, her expression went from open apprehension to relief. "There you are.
Run away, little girl.
Praise be. I was beginning to think you had either left or..." Her voice trailed off without her explaining what fate she had imagined might have taken him. But Kalek did not care. There should have been no difference between seeing her actually standing before him and viewing her through the tear he had earlier created. But now the sense that Kalek had come to identify with Jaina and only Jaina reached the blue dragon. Even in his half-elven form, his senses were more acute than those of the being he resembled, and in this case, more acute than Jaina's. She did not know how she smelled to him, or how welcome those scents were to the former aspect.
Beware.
"Forgive me," she went on at last, approaching him at the same time. "I tried to contact you again,
Beware.
and when I didn't even sense you, I finally had to travel here myself." His brow furrowed. Kalek was well aware just how much effort Jaina would have had to put in to journey here so quickly. While a part of him was very grateful on a number of levels at this tremendous show of concern, he reminded himself of the potential danger facing her if she came into close contact with the artifact. Even if it only cast her mind into the visions, that might prove too much for her. The artifact had taken enough of a toll on him. While very powerful, she was still human. "You should not have concerned yourself, Jane. I did hear you call to me, but I was in the midst of trying to revitalize some of the wards and could not risk halting the work at that point. I intended to contact you as soon as I could. Kalek, you should really have some help, even if it's me and me alone." Kalek knew that even if he did agree to her aiding him, no good would come of it, especially for Jaina. He remembered too well the distrust with which some of the other Magi had begun to look at their leader because of her growing relationship with a blue dragon. "I'm grateful for the depths of your concern," he began carefully, not only hoping to avoid offending her, but also praying that the artifact would not choose this moment to cast him back. "But you have so many other matters you need to worry about." "The others." "I know about the others," Jaina interjected just a bit sharply. "I need no counsel from them regarding what I can and cannot do. They wanted me to be their leader. Now they can accept my choices." For the moment, Kalek forgot his troubles. The last thing he wanted was for Jaina to jeopardize her position. In addition to his own concerns, he had hoped that by leaving, he would cause no more harm to the Archmage. But as leader, You also have responsibilities to your people, the blue dragon reminded her. And I am not part of your people. I'm sorry I have added to your worries, Jaina. Please trust me that your place is with your own, not assisting me here. It came out colder than he had planned. Jaina's expression did not change, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze. Finally nodding, she looked away. Perhaps you're right. Forgive me for being impetuous. I just had to come myself to see what was happening. Her eyes returned to his. But I take your word that you're well, Kalek. He kept his own eyes steady, despite the guilt growing within him. All is well. He started to reach for her, but put his hand down before she could notice the movement. Thank you. Where he had held back, Jaina chose to act. One slim hand touched his arm, remaining there long enough to make an unspoken point. Then the Archmage stepped back, and with a brief smile, began her teleportation spell. When at last he was alone again, Kalek exhaled sharply. He hoped that Jaina would take to heart his reluctance to have her near, and would not try to attempt any further contact. At least then, one fear of his would be no more. And as for the greatest of his fears, Kalek could think of only one course of action to take with the relic. While he could not yet prevent it from affecting him, he could make certain that it bothered no one else. That meant that more than ever, the wards had to be strengthened. At this point, no one, not even other blue dragons, could be allowed to enter the Nexus. Not until he had dealt with the situation. Kalek felt fortunate that Jaina had not come any earlier. If she had, she might have discovered the truth and endangered herself by trying to help him. The task giving him renewed focus, Kalek headed back to where he had been working when the visions had last taken him. He prayed that he would be given the time at least to do this, if not for himself, then for the sake of Jaina or anyone else who sought entrance to the Nexus. There was no hint of anything wrong when he arrived, for which he was grateful. He considered confronting the artifact first, but chose to remain with his decision. If the powers of the relic were for the moment dormant, he preferred to keep it that way. Kalek prepared himself for his work just as he had before. The ley lines appeared before his veiled gaze. He began manipulating the power, growing more satisfied with each step he completed. Within minutes, the first ward had been strengthened enough that he decided to go on to the next. The second proved even quicker to fortify. Kalek felt a rare moment of pride. It had been a long time since he had accomplished anything. He reached for the third ward. There was something attached to its spellwork, something neither he nor any blue dragon had cast. The artifact's magic had insinuated itself in the ward. Kalek immediately withdrew for fear that he would stir up whatever the artifact intended. An unease crept over him, and he sought out the next ward. That, too, was now linked to the artifact. The former aspect frowned, then returned his attention to the one he had just finished strengthening. Like the others, it was also linked. Linked when it had not been a few seconds before. Quickly dismissing the rest, he focused on the first and, not at all to his surprise, found that the artifact had also connected its power to that ward. The uneasiness swelled. Kalek took a deep breath, stepped back, and without hesitation, brought forth the entire array that formed the Nexus's network of defensive spells. The hiss that escaped him was far more suited to his draconic form than to the half-elven one he currently wore. The former aspect glared. The power of the artifact was now a part of each and every ward in the Nexus. Three, the Afflicted. Jaina Proudmoore reappeared in her chambers, her exhaustion having more to do with Kalek than with her magical efforts. She knew that he was hiding much from her, and while she appreciated his obvious worry for her, she also resented it. Kalek was a blue dragon, and yes, that meant that he understood aspects of the magical arts in a way that even she did not. But Jaina also considered herself more than capable of facing most such situations, and using human adaptability to ferret out solutions that perhaps a dragon might not think about. She summoned a chair to her. Taking a minute to gather her thoughts, the Archmage relived her visit to the Nexus. With those thoughts came guilt of her own. She had held back some of the truth from Kalek, too. Jaina had not arrived just before he had noticed her. In fact, she was the one he had almost discovered. Only a quick manipulation of magic had enabled her to focus his attention elsewhere long enough for her to shift her location to where it would seem she had just entered the area. And even that might not have been necessary, if Jaina had not been concerned that Kalek would realize just how long she had been there. Long enough to discover the relic. The Archmage had no more precise name for it. Artifact, relic. Jaina suspected that Kalek thought of it in the same terms. It was like nothing she had ever seen, and that included personal knowledge of a variety of powerful magical objects comparable to the collections stored in the Nexus. Yet if it was like nothing she had ever seen, it was not entirely a mystery to her. She did a significant factor, possibly something that even Kalek might not recognize. She had come across such spell work in the past, only twice, and of a much lesser degree, but she had definitely seen its like before. It was a spell work older than dragons, spell work that bespoke of a unique knowledge lost to magi of her time. Spell work that Jaina, at least, believed had ties to the legendary keepers, or even the Titans themselves. The Archmage had certainly not journeyed to the Nexus with such a discovery in her mind. All she had truly had to go on was her suspicion that there was something in the Nexus tied to Kalek's strange behavior. It had been her intention to speak with him, and find an excuse while doing so to use her power surreptitiously to seek anything amiss. Jaina had believed that she could do this without even Kalek sensing it. And had that opportunity not presented itself, she had plotted other ways by which she would have had some time alone to try to decipher the truth. However, all of her planning had proved unnecessary, for there had been no hint of Kalek upon her arrival. The weakened wards had made it easy to gain entrance, and once she had verified that Kalek was nowhere to be seen, she had begun to investigate her surroundings. To her surprise, finding the relic had been quite easy. It had radiated a unique magical trace. In addition, it seemed that Kalek had not even bothered to secrete it in one of the many arcane prisons or other caches designed to hold such powerful magical items. The artifact had simply sat out in the open in the first major chamber she entered. Some might have been unnerved by the thing, but Jaina had only been fascinated. She studied its aura, admired its design, and delved as deeply as she cautiously could into its core. But in the end, Jaina had learned little. So significant was this find that she had actually considered taking the artifact with her, even despite the near disaster created by her intention to use another relic, the Iris, in revenge for Theramore's destruction by it at the hands of the orc Garrosh. However, before Jaina could bring herself to seize the artifact in the Nexus, the Archmage had suddenly sensed Kalek nearby. Not sure how he would react to her obvious intrusion, Jaina had masked her presence as best she could, then worked to make certain that Kalek did not know she was there, while she quickly shifted her location. Even then, he had almost noticed her. Yet, if Jaina did not have the artifact with her to study, she did have access to other avenues that might give her a clue to what it was, and how it might be related to the changes in Kalek's personality. Jaina was convinced that he was in desperate danger, perhaps not only to his mind, but also to his body. Jaina summoned a thick silver tome from the highest shelf. As it neared her, the book opened and pages began flipping. A narrowing of the Archmage's eyes caused the pages to cease turning. With the book still hovering at reading level, she surveyed the contents. The Archmage who had written these pages had marked the 2 items she was particularly interested in as remnants of the period shortly after order had been brought to Azeroth. Jaina had sought these because something in the artifact's appearance had reminded her of something the Archmage had read when first she had combed through this book for other reasons. To her frustration, the 2 pages before her presented Jaina with nothing. There were details of where the items had been found and who had been involved in discovering them. There were also notations on previous studies of the Titans and Keepers believed to have been identified as having influenced the regions where the finds had been made. While such notes were interesting to Jaina in a scholarly way, she sought more. The page turned. Theories about the Titans and the Keepers dominated, some concerning the extent of their ties to one another. Jaina started to skip farther ahead, then recalled something mentioned within the theories.
Greetings.
She found it. As the young mage Ralpho insisted, the vision he claimed to have had from touching it suggested Keeper influence in its design. Archmage Theolinus had his own theory on Keeper influence in other regions. Jaina let out a grunt of exasperation. She skipped down past theories that she normally would have had more interest in, hoping to find what she thought she recalled. The name Ralpho finally came up again. It had been so long since Jaina had read through this part that she could not remember what else Ralpho had told his masters about the vision, but surely it had to be in this section. But scarcely had she begun reading when the Archmage stepped back in such shock that she accidentally cancelled the spell holding the book in place. The ancient tome dropped with a loud thud on the floor, the pages now askew. Her heart pounding, Jaina knelt by the damaged book. Her concern was not for what she had allowed to happen to it, but for rereading the passage. With a wave of her hand, the other pages flew by until the one she sought once again faced her. Ralpho, Jaina muttered, seeking his name. Ralpho might have had the answer to that. His death is a sad footnote to an otherwise intriguing expedition into a study of the past. She had gone too far. The Archmage went back a few paragraphs. Once there, Jaina read more carefully. The 3rd day after the find, an entire afternoon of searching revealed nothing, not even the finest spells at work. Only after dark, only when one last attempt was made, did someone find his body. Body, Jaina murmured, praying that she had read wrong. According to reports, at first glance, the consensus was that he had somehow lost his way and fallen off the peak. Certainly that explained how mangled Ralpho's corpse was said to be. However, Later conversations by the representative of the Kirin Tor with those who knew him best give indication of a peculiar and sudden madness that descended upon Rolfo prior to his disappearance. The ultimate conclusion was that this vision the young mage mentioned was the start of his insanity. It ended there, the next paragraph continuing on with matters Jaina found for the moment tedious. Still certain that she had read more than this previously, she desperately searched the succeeding pages, but to no avail. She returned to the ones she had read and studied them closely, but quickly verified that she had missed nothing. And yet, somewhere she had read more. The Archmage cast her eyes upon the many tomes, scrolls, journals, and other writings before her. Within one of them, the details she hunted for surely existed. She just had to recall which one, or keep looking until she found what she sought. But staring at the imposing collection, the Archmage wondered if, after she managed to locate the information, it would already be too late for Kalek. The artifact was as bound to the Nexus's wards as if it had been so set since the latter were first cast. Kalek doubted that Malagos could have weaved the accursed thing's power into the array with such mastery. It again bespoke the great skill of whoever had created the relic, a being the blue dragon could only assume was the cloaked and hooded form of which both he and the young Malagos had caught glimpses. A being Kalek had already come to hate deeply. For what seemed the 100th time, Kalek followed a magical trail in the array in the hopes of finding some flaw that he could exploit. He did not want to leave the Nexus at the mercy of the artifact, even though thus far it had done no visible harm to the place. Still, considering what it had done to Kalek, the Blue did not want to take any chances. Tainted! Tainted! With a pained roar, Kalek pulled back from his work. He clutched his head, trying to keep the voices at bay, but they shouted so loudly that all else was drowned out. Must destroy them. No, they are us. No, they ate one of us. The Nexus became a maelstrom. Kalek lost his balance, spun around, and fell. But before he struck the floor, he suddenly hovered above the ground, surveying what appeared to be the start of a civil war among the proto-dragons Talanixa had gathered. At least 7 individual combats caught his eye, or rather Malagos's eye, and one of them included both Neltharion and Nozdormu. Despite the fight being 2 against 1, the pair was very tentative in its attacks against the silver-green female before them. She, on the other hand, snapped and clawed at them with abandon, eschewing tactics of any sort. As Malagos landed nearby, she lunged at Neltharion. Malagos knew well by now the charcoal grey male's eagerness for battle, and so was surprised when Neltharion sought desperately to avoid her sharp but smaller teeth. Neltharion scuttled back as the jaws neared his throat, and Nozdormu leapt in at the perfect moment and tore out the preoccupied female's gullet. He struck so artfully that he had already withdrawn before the female even realized that she was mortally wounded. Her chest quickly soaking with her blood, the stricken proto-dragon started to turn toward Nozdormu, then fell on her face. As Kalek and his hosts struggled to make sense of events, the other seemingly mad proto-dragons were herded together. Some of those facing the prisoners appeared to be barely able to keep from trying to rip them apart. One of those preventing that was Ysera, who was issuing a warning. "Be careful! Watch, teeth! Stay back!" Beyond the scene, Talanixa watched with an unreadable expression. Kalek wanted Malagos to keep an eye on her, but his host was more interested in what Ysera was attempting to do. The more the tableau unfolded, the more it appeared that Alexstrasza's sister was every bit as concerned for the afflicted as she was for those surrounding them. While both Malagos and Kalek could appreciate that she was trying to prevent further bloodshed among proto-dragons when the true threat was clearly Galakrond, the Blue Dragon and his host were in agreement that this could not end well. The surrounded band snapped at their captors and seemed not to recognize those whom Malagos knew they should. Malagos noticed something about each of the captured proto-dragons. Every one of those whom the icy blue male could see sported bite wounds from some previous but still recent fight. Bite wounds. Malagos started to glance down at his paw, only to be interrupted by Alexstrasza. The fire-orange female looked relieved to see him. "You live? We thought you dead." "Almost. Koros, he is dead." Before he could relay to her the full tale and its import, Alexstrasza looked back at where her sister still worked to keep the two groups from converging on each other. "She does not understand. They must die. Even I know that." That drew Malagos's attention from the need to tell his story. "Must die? Why?" "The bites. The bites of the not-living. They make a hunger. They make these want to eat one another. They make them like Galakrond." Her words shook both Kalek and his host. Malagos could not keep from shivering as he remembered his struggles after being bitten. He looked past Alexstrasza to the maddened proto-dragons, recalling his own growing bloodlust and how he had barely kept from doing just as these apparently desired. Alexstrasza mistook his reaction for disgust at what the captives had turned into. She hissed. "Ysera thinks of our clutch brother. She thinks him out there still." This further dismayed Malagos. "Would be not living." "Clutch brother long dead," Alexstrasza reminded him. "Long dead when Malagos finds him." That should have reassured him. But so many things had happened that even a clever proto-dragon, such as Malagos considered himself, had doubts. True, other old corpses had remained dead, at least the last time Malagos had seen them. Now the icy blue male wondered whether those corpses would still be there if he went to find them again. And then his thoughts returned to just how these other proto-dragons had been changed. They had all been bitten. They had all succumbed to the monstrous hunger that Malagos had fought more than once. Kalek sensed his host considering fleeing before someone recognized the wound and added him to the mad. Still, Malagos held his ground and watched as the tableau played out. Talonyxa finally acted, shoving past smaller proto-dragons to face Ysera and the afflicted. Despite their growing madness, the imprisoned proto-dragons remained cowed by the powerful female. "Kill them." "No! Must help them!" Ysera insisted, staring defiantly. "Kill them, or they bite us." As she spoke, Talonyxa pressed Alexstrasza's sister back, forcing her closer to the mad. "They bite you." Whether a bite from one of the afflicted would affect a proto-dragon the way a bite from the undead did was a question Kalek doubted any there knew the answer to yet. But Talonyxa's words stirred fear in several of those in attendance. Even Alexstrasza's sister looked uncertain. Without warning, one of the afflicted hissed and started toward Ysera. Before Alexstrasza could go to her sister's aid, Ysera, her uncertainty vanishing, turned her steady gaze on her would-be attacker. The madness faded somewhat. The other proto-dragon let his head drop low, then shuffled back. To Kalek he seemed ashamed that he had tried to harm the smaller female. Ysera again faced Talanixa. "Must help them. No time. We must fight Galakrond," the larger female declared. She looked to those watching the argument. "We fight! Yes!" As they had before, the majority of the other proto-dragons hissed their agreement. Even in the face of such a lack of support, Ysera pressed. "These are us! These are us!" The gathering quieted. Alexstrasza's sister moved toward the crowd, beseeching. "These are us! We help them! We help us!" Some of those listening looked at one another in thought. Talanix's eyes narrowed more. "Yes," she hissed quietly, suddenly very agreeable. "Yes, we help them." Talanixa eyed the afflicted. "But must keep them safe. Must keep us safe. Help them when we can." She turned and studied the west. "Must keep them safe, yes. Come, bring them." Clearly confident that she would be obeyed, Talanixa took flight. Several of the proto-dragons surrounding the afflicted looked warily at Ysera. Alexstrasza's sister stared at them with defiance, then glanced at the captured figures. "Come," she murmured soothingly. "Come." Slowly, Ysera rose into the air. As she did, she gestured with her head after Talanixa. The surrounded proto-dragons reluctantly followed Ysera. They were flanked by Talanixa's ardent supporters. The rest of the assembled proto-dragons looked more than willing to stay behind. But to Kalek's surprise, his host suddenly leapt after Ysera. Even Alexstrasza was not so swift. Out of the corner of Malagos's eye, Kalek saw Neltharion and Nosdormu follow suit. The scene abruptly shifted, but Kalek sensed that only a short time had passed. Now Talanixa led the band toward a narrow valley. "There!" she roared, indicating with the dip of her wing another pass. Talanixa descended. As the proto-dragons landed, the large female strode toward what initially looked simply like a rock wall. However, as they followed Talanixa around, a narrow crevice revealed itself. At first, Kalek thought it was the entrance to the cave from the one disturbing vision. However, almost immediately, too many details gave indication that it was otherwise. Still, Kalek could not help feeling that he knew the reason Talanixa had brought them to this place. "Why here?" Ysera asked with a hint of suspicion. "These ones you defend, they go in here and wait." The pale yellow female peered at the narrow entrance, her suspicion growing. "In there? All. Or we must slay." The finality of her tone brooked no argument. With reluctance, Ysera at last nodded. "They stay here," Talanixa commanded. She indicated some of those guarding the afflicted. "4 here. They guard. Entrance narrow. 4 enough." It was clear to Kalek and his host that Talanixa would have gladly had the afflicted slaughtered there and then, and Ysera obviously also saw that. She finally acquiesced, then led those she had championed toward the narrow entrance. One by one, the trusting proto-dragons entered the cave. Some had to struggle to get inside, so restrictive was the entrance. Ysera had to keep calming both those waiting to enter and those already inside. The last finally entered. Ysera backed away in order to let the guards take their places. But as the first began to move, Tylenix rumbled, "Wait." Ysera hissed. Malagos and Neltharion started toward Tylenix, only to have some of the Golden Female's most ardent followers block their path. Tylenix exhaled. Lightning shot from her maw. 3 bright silver bolts struck the rock face above the entrance. As that happened, a calm Tylenix fluttered back a few short yards. The entire rock face collapsed, spilling over the cave. Ysera leapt toward the avalanche, but before she could sacrifice herself in a vain attempt to save those within, Malagos lunged for her. To his surprise, Nozdormu reached her first, seizing one of her wings with his jaws and carefully but firmly pulling her back just before she would have been crushed to a pulp. Despite there being no doubt regarding Nozdormu's or Malagos's intentions, Ysera snapped at both of them. Her rage undiminished, she whirled on Tylenix. 4 other proto-dragons blocked her path. 2 opened their mouths, but Tylenix's hiss rose above the confrontation, stilling their attack. "It is done," she proclaimed, her massive wings stretched to enhance her size and thus her dominance. "No taint among us. All tainted must die." Ysera exhaled. The 2 guards directly in front of her blinked and nearly collapsed. Stunned, they proved no impediment to her charge. She burst past them and sought Tylenix. But the larger female awaited this foolhardy act. She shifted as Ysera neared. Her long, powerful tail struck her much smaller adversary across the head with a loud crack. Alexstrasza rushed by Malagos and the others in time to reach her sister, just as Ysera fell back, stunned. The 2 crashed into each other, ending in a heap. "It is done," Tylenix repeated, acting as if she had not even noticed Ysera's impudence. "Come. Must be ready for Galakron." With that, Tylenix and all except for Malagos and his friends silently departed. The males moved in to aid the sisters, only to have Ysera roll to her feet and rush to the buried cave. Ignoring the small bits of stone and dirt still raining down, she used her hind paws to try to rip away at the tons of rock. However, as Ysera tore at the avalanche, additional stones loosened above. They fell down, not only more than replacing what she dug away, but also battering her enough that Alexstrasza, at last righted, risked injury to herself, and pulled her struggling sibling to safety. "Save them," the smaller sister insisted, her frantic gaze darting from Alexstrasza to the males. "They still live. Hear them!" Malagos listened, but detected nothing. Yet both Kalek and his host, and also the other future aspects, knew that Ysera spoke the truth. There was just nothing they could do. 100 proto-dragons digging without pause would not have been able to reach those within in time. Malagos understood that as well as Kalek, and so did the rest, even Ysera. Still, despite her awareness of the futility of what she attempted, Ysera again rushed to the fall and tried digging. She kicked away rock after rock, only to have more fill the momentary gaps. The others finally shoved in front of Ysera and forced her away. She continued to stare at the buried entrance, and at one point, through Malagos's ears, Kalek heard her say, gasping, "Draland." After several tense moments, Alexstrasza's sister stilled. However, now there was a distant look in her eyes, as if her mind remained elsewhere. "We must go," Malagos at last suggested quietly. Neltharion added, The hunt for Galakrond will begin soon. We must be there. The hunt for Galakrond? Nosdormu mocked, startling both Malagos and Kalek by even speaking. From what Kalek gathered from his host, young Nosdormu spoke only when he seemed to have something significant to add. Otherwise, some might have taken him for one of the less advanced, more animalistic proto-dragons, unable to talk. Hunted by, it will be. Yet, despite saying that, the brown male was the first to leap into the air. To the surprise of the rest, Ysera immediately followed. Alexstrasza joined her sister, leaving Malagos and Neltharion to find themselves bringing up the rear. However, as they ascended, Kalek, but not Malagos, noticed Ysera surreptitiously glancing back at the ruined cave. Afflicted proto-dragons likely still struggled to survive before the air gave out. She then glanced at Malagos, but not directly at his face. Rather, Kalek noted that she eyed his lower leg. The same leg where the one undead had bitten Malagos's paw.
This time you will encounter more difficult illusions.
4. The Watcher. Kalek's view shifted again. Ahead of the 5, Talanixa and her gathered host hovered in the air. He realized that they were already setting out to find Galakrond. Several of the other proto-dragons noted the small band's arrival, which in turn alerted Talanixa. She soared toward the 5, her attendants flanking her. As Talanixa confronted Ysera and her companions, the attendants spread out in obvious battle formation. Malagos and the others instinctively did the same, even against the greater odds. These can join the hunt, Talanixa decreed. You, Runt, will not. I will come with, Ysera insisted. Why? Talk to Galakrond? Make a tiny bite for him. Recalling Koros, whose fate Malagos had still not yet told to Talanixa, the icy blue male shuddered. Kalek shared his unease and wished that Malagos would quickly tell everyone in the hopes that perhaps it would deter them from this mad attack. However, his host didn't speak, at the moment only concerned with the safety of his friends and not thinking of the potential repercussions of saying nothing. Will not go, Alexstrasza said. We'll stay with my sister. I stay also, Nosdormu briefly added. Neltharion momentarily looked frustrated, his natural tendency being to go wherever a fight could be promised. Still, he grudgingly nodded his agreement with the other two. Malagos added his voice to his friends. Not that Talanixa seemed to care at that point. She started to turn from the 5. Only then did Kalek's host finally recall what he should have told everyone at the first chance. Wait! Must speak of Koros. A suspicious Talanixa looked back. Koros? As best he could, Malagos quickly related to her and the rest the fate of the treacherous proto-dragon, leaving out only those details where his own struggle with the infection from the undead's bite were concerned. The far simpler language of his host frustrated Kalek, who knew that he could have explained much more clearly, but the essence of what Malagos sought to tell was evidently understood by Talanixa and the others. But rather than be daunted by the savage tale, the imposing female simply sneered. Koros, fool, but gives us victory. She peered at her loyal but confused followers. Galakrond knows where we are, where we go. We fool him. We attack before. We attack in different place. Not good, Nosdormu muttered, his words going unheard by the increasingly confident Talanixa. Must strike now. She spun from Malagos again. Come! We attack! The gathered proto-dragons left, the 5 behind. Neltharion fluttered back and forth, obviously desiring to be a part of the coming battle, but in the end choosing his comrades over his desires. Still he could not help expressing himself. Why we not fight? Not like Talanixa, but we fight our way. We fight our own plan. And die as stupidly as they. Nosdormu, proving quite talkative this day, interrupted calmly. There must be peace. Even Alexstrasza eyed her sister with something close to exasperation. Ysera. Without warning, the smaller female darted off. There was no doubt about her intentions. She still hoped to change the course of events, however mad that seemed to both Kalek and his host. Worse, Alexstrasza immediately chased after her sister, which caused the increasingly impatient Neltharion to do the same. Nosdormu looked to Malagos. If this... The scene suddenly shifted. Even though Kalek was better prepared for it, he still raged at being ripped from the moment before he knew how it would continue to play. There was a very real feeling running through him that despite the fact that all of this took place in the past, it had a relevance to his time that he dared not ignore. He, as much as Malagos, darted among the frosty peaks of the northern regions in great haste, searching with more and more desperation for someone whom at first Kalek could not identify from the proto-dragon's racing thoughts. The only thing that Kalek could tell was that something had caused a change in events. What it was finally flashed through Malagos's mind as he dived to investigate a shallow cave in one frosty area. Talanixa's great host had been unable to find the gargantuan Galakrond. How a creature as huge as the twisted proto-dragon could suddenly vanish was a question that greatly plagued Kalek's host and also bothered Kalek. However, it was not the reason for Malagos's mad hunt in this obscure place, far too near the misshapen Leviathan's known haunts. Malagos was hunting Ysera. A shadow crossed Malagos. Neltharion dropped down. Nothing, the charcoal gray male bellowed. I smell her, but nothing. Her scent pervaded the area, but was not strong enough to be identified as very recent. Ysera might have passed this way as long ago as 2 days. Kalek understood now that it had been 4 days since the shift in the vision. Indeed, the last time anyone had seen Ysera was shortly after that scene had changed for Kalek. The weaker female had risen into the thick clouds, whereupon her trail had somehow faded. It had taken a frantic Alexstrasza another day and a half to locate a trail, but only after the 4 had already confronted an angry Talanixa, leading a befuddled force in search of the absent Galakrond. He is scared, Talanixa had roared at the top of her voice for any to hear, perhaps even Galakrond himself. He knows we hunt. He flees us. This had hardly been the opinion of Malagos or his friends, but their voices had not been of interest to Talanixa. She had led her army off to the east, leaving the 4 to continue their own search. But why Ysera had abandoned the others when she had was still not apparent. Malagos had his suspicions, and from what Kalek divined, his host believed, not unreasonably, that Alexstrasza's sister had sought out Galakrond to plead again for a stop to the carnage. If so, There was a very good reason she had thus far remained unfound. A reason that none of the three males dared speak out loud in the presence of Alexstrasza. Ysera might already be a victim of Galakrond, foolishly placing herself in the mad behemoth's maw as easily as Koros had. "Saw nothing," Malygos informed Neltharion now, his pulse still pounding from his own swift search. Another proto-dragon soared above. Seeing that it was Nosdormu, both calmed. The third male appeared to have had no better luck than they. Of Alexstrasza there was no sign, although Kalek understood that Malygos had a fair notion where she could be found. Once arriving at this place where Ysera's scent had grown stronger, they had divided up to cover certain areas where a proto-dragon could more easily be hidden from sight. But thus far, they had discovered nothing. "She is not here," Neltharion suggested. "Was, but is not." His tone echoed Malygos's own concerns about Ysera's fate. Neither wanted to be the one to approach Alexstrasza with what seemed more and more the truth. "Maybe search more," the charcoal gray male recommended with some hesitation. "Maybe flew too fast. I do that." They both knew that they had scoured their respective areas thoroughly, but being reluctant to face a dismayed Alexstrasza, they split up again. Malygos banked, then dropped lower. He did not expect to find anything, Kalek knew, but the only other choice was to report his failure to the fire-orange female. The sharp eyes of the hunter surveyed the icy soil and frosty rock walls ahead. Malygos quickly recognized the few places where Ysera might have been able to secrete herself. However, he already knew that she could not have possibly slipped by him, and sure enough, the first three locations were as empty as he recalled them. Something moved near the mouth of the last cave. It was such a brief glimpse that neither Kalek nor his host could identify just what it was. The proto-dragon dived to investigate. He slowed when he neared the cave. There was the danger that whatever lurked within was not only not Ysera, but a threat. Malygos squinted. The cave was utterly dark. That in itself unsettled the proto-dragon. His sharp eyes should have been able to penetrate the blackness for at least a few feet. Kalek's trepidation matched Malygos's as the proto-dragon first sniffed the air, then, scenting nothing, chose to enter. Visibility remained almost non-existent as Malygos progressed. The icy blue male hesitated. Kalek's host sensed something amiss, but it was nothing that his mind could identify. However, Kalek, able to feel the ancient world, noted the hint of some great power nearby. "Welcome, clever hunter," came a deep voice with an otherworldly quality that made Kalek want to gasp, and made Malygos instinctively retreat a step from that direction. A low silver light arose from the darkness. Within, a cloaked and hooded form already familiar to Kalek coalesced. Hissing, Malygos retreated again. Yet if the proto-dragon sought the way out, he was not to find it, nor was even Kalek able to note where it was. Only darkness prevailed, except where the tiny figure stood. Curiously, though, despite the fact that Malygos loomed over it, the mysterious figure unnerved the proto-dragon. It had little to do with what was to Malygos a very odd two-legged shape, and more to do with the tremendous power Kalek had earlier felt. But while Kalek had come to grips with the fact that through his host he confronted the form he had caught out of the corner of his eye in the Nexus, the dragon began to notice something else amiss with the being before them. Although by Kalek's estimation, the murky figure was barely taller than a night elf, the more Kalek studied it, the more the blue dragon could not help thinking that what he saw was not what actually stood there. He had the feeling of a being far more imposing than this, a being that instead of gazing up at the proto-dragon, should have been gazing down. "Who are you?" Malagos demanded. "Who?" "Follow the strengthening wind when you depart," the figure answered, at first making no sense to either Kalek or his host. "You will find your friend there." Another hiss escaped Malagos. "What thing are you?" "A friend, I hope." From the cloak emerged the strong hand of what Kalek judged to be a warrior. It pulled the hood back. For the proto-dragon it was yet another revelation of just how strange the creature was. For Kalek, though, what stood revealed was enough to identify the figure for what he was, even though the dragon had never himself seen such beings in the flesh. A keeper. It can only be a keeper, Kalek thought with awe. The keepers were creatures of myth and legend to most other races. Even as the aspect of magic, Kalek had learned little of them beyond their work overseeing the refinement of Azeroth after the Titans brought order to it, and the fact that several of the keepers had built temples in the Storm Peaks. Evidence of their achievements could also be found in obscure places around the world, but the full effect of their great task remained a question. The skin was a brilliant silver. A thick, long mustache stretching down to the chest matched the golden hair framing the sturdy, broad-jawed face. Under a heavy brow, eyes the color of the sun and like those of night elves, outwardly seeming to lack pupils, studied the proto-dragon with not only interest, but what appeared to be pride. What does he find of so much interest in Malagos? Kalek wondered. You may call me Tyr, the keeper finally answered the proto-dragon's original question. And you are, of course, Malagos. Kalek's host understandably flinched. Baring his teeth, the proto-dragon growled, How do you know my name? I have watched you. I have watched others. I see much potential in you, in these friends of yours, and I say that as someone who has watched many of your kind since the first of you began to stir toward self-consciousness. His answer only made Malagos shake his head in bewilderment and growing mistrust. Tyr was not a huge creature. Malagos believed that he could bite Tyr in half, but he also believed that attempting to do so would, for unknown reasons, be something that the proto-dragon would regret. He turned away, once more seeking the missing entrance. This time it revealed itself. However, Malagos made no move toward it, as aware as Kalek that it had reappeared too conveniently. Malagos, of course, did not yet understand magic as Kalek did, but he was clever enough to link the odd happenings with the being who already knew his name without asking. Malagos peered over his shoulder at Tyr. If it is your wish to leave, I will not stop you, Tyr said. With a reptilian grin, Malagos chose to take him at his word. He darted through the gap, clearly expecting to be prevented at the last second. Instead, the open air greeted the icy blue male. The moment he was fully outside, Malagos swung around to face the cave. Kalek understood that he expected to find Tyr following, but of the keeper there was no sign. You see, I did not lie. Snarling, Malagos gazed up at the top of a low ridge. There an innocent-looking Tyr stood patiently waiting. The proto-dragon rose into the air until he hovered over the cloaked figure. Tyr calmly spread both hands wide, a sign of peace. Despite that display, Malygos did not relax, and even Kalek wondered what exactly such a formidable being wanted with a proto-dragon. "Not funny," Malygos snapped, rearing his head. He prepared to exhale, something that Kalek thought would only lead to disaster. But at the last moment, the proto-dragon changed his mind. Instead, Malygos veered from the tiny figure and headed on. He did not get far before discovering Tyr standing atop another ridge ahead of him. While this hardly surprised Kalek, the young Malygos proved a hard-headed sort. He immediately turned in another direction and flew as hard as he could from the spot where Tyr stood. The cloaked figure reappeared a short distance ahead. This time Malygos did not hesitate to exhale. Kalek sensed that his host wished not to slay Tyr, only to keep him from following. The stream of frost shot toward Tyr, then split, spraying the rocky surroundings, but not touching him in the least. "Please," Tyr quietly began again, "I wish only to talk with you about Galakrond." Malygos's mind struggled between attacking, fleeing, and hearing the strange creature out. To Kalek's relief, his host chose the last. "What do you want? Where is Ysera?" "You will find her, and you will find other things, but those I cannot change." Tyr did not elaborate, instead returning to his original subject. "But for the moment, we must speak quickly, and about Galakrond." The continued mention of the sinister behemoth made the proto-dragon anxiously glance around, but of course there was no sign of the gargantuan fiend. Malygos peered expectantly at Tyr. "We never intended this path," Tyr continued, his own gaze turning inward. A shadow crossed his features. "Galakrond should never have journeyed in the direction he did, and we did not prevent it. Now this young world faces annihilation." While Malygos did not understand all of the complex words, he understood enough to catch that there was some tie between Galakrond and this thing. Kalek understood even more than Malygos, but in the end, his thoughts finished the same. This being, this keeper, knew why Galakrond had become the monster, and felt some fault at that happening. Before Malygos could press the questions that Kalek and he shared, Tyr cut him off. "I have been observing so many of you, seeking an answer. I thought for a while, but Koros proved as focused in his obsession as Galakrond, but with more foolhardiness than even Galakrond contained, it seems." "Koros? You watch him? Why?" For the first time, a hint of frustration passed across Tyr's sturdy face. Kalek, though, saw that it was frustration not with Malygos, but with Tyr himself. "A good question, with no good answer. I leave it at that. What matters is that you might be the key to salvaging this situation. If we can turn this mad charge from disaster to victory." The proto-dragon continued to hover, but Kalek felt his patience quickly fraying. Proto-dragons did not have the patience of dragons, although even Kalek knew his could be very short at times. Malygos was coming close to trying to flee again. Tyr obviously saw that also. He smiled briefly, as if to reassure the proto-dragon. "In our seeking to guide Azeroth's growth as a whole, We have been too long removed from the daily aspects of the world, too long from interacting with the life of that world. Without guidance, events somehow brought us Galakrond. With guidance, we and your kind might be able to set Kalimdor back on its destined path. We fight Galakrond? Malagos's tone made clear his questioning of the sanity of Tyr's suggestion. Tylenixa fights Galakrond. We do not fight. He shook his head. Foolish creature you are. This time, Malagos did attempt another escape. He flew around Tyr, going such a great distance to the side of the cloaked figure that Kalek could not help but wonder if the proto-dragon also sensed that while Tyr appeared tiny, he was in actuality something far larger, far greater. Kalek and his host both expected Tyr to materialize before them, but there was no sign. While Malagos took heart from this, Kalek could not fathom why Tyr would simply let the proto-dragon go. Suddenly, what appeared to be a wall stood before the racing Malagos. He managed to bank at the last moment, and as he did, something unsettling about the wall registered with both the proto-dragon and Kalek. It was not a wall, but the torso of some gigantic, two-legged form. But as Malagos spun back, he found no giant, only Tyr. Still, even the young proto-dragon understood that he had caught a glimpse of what Tyr truly was. That glimpse was powerful enough to make him eye the tiny creature once more standing before him with something near awe. But Tyr's expression extinguished Malagos's obvious hope that what the proto-dragon had momentarily seen could mean Galakrond's defeat. We are not tied to this world as your kind is. The others of my kind cannot be urged any more to face this danger. We have grown too weary from our past battles. I need your kind, Malagos. I need you. Still hovering, the proto-dragon finally nodded. What we do? Tyr looked vastly relieved. First, we must gather your friends. Together, I think they could be the answer. Nowhere else have I seen this immediate and intricate bonding among those of different proto-dragon families. Perhaps it might ironically even have something to do with Galakrond's coming. I do not know. Whatever the reason, this bonding may be the key to the only chance of victory still left to us. Some of the words were, again, more than Malagos could comprehend. However, he could easily detect Tyr's uncertainty that even Malagos and his kind would be enough to prevent Galakrond from ravaging Azeroth. Gather the others, Malagos. They trust you. Lead them here. I will be waiting. A warning roar echoed from the east, a roar so thundering it could only belong to Galakrond. Tyr turned at the cry. Malagos's gaze swept past him to look in the same direction, and in that moment, the cloak swung aside, revealing something that only Kalek noticed, and only Kalek would have recognized. Attached by netting to a thick silver belt was nothing less than the artifact itself. Even as Kalek saw this, the scene turned on its head, and its elements shattered, scattering in all directions. The blackness had a second before the elements regathered and formed a new scene. Proto-dragons filled the sky. By the scores, they roared their challenge at the horizon before them. As Kalek sought to identify what was happening, Malagos joined the others in seemingly challenging the empty air. And the sky answered. Galakrond, still so distant that he could not be seen, answered. Kalek silently swore. Somehow he, or rather Malagos, had become part of Talonix's grand and likely doomed charge after all. Five, the dead and the undead. Jane awoke with a start, her head snapping up from the pages of the musty book she was reading when exhaustion had claimed her. The Archmage eyed the faint moisture on one page and gestured with some slight irritation. The page dried, none the worse for the wear. Another waste of time. She pointed her finger at the wall of books and parchments. The book fluttered to the spot from which she had summoned it. Thoughts other than her own abruptly filled her head, messages sent by various magi seeking her advice or reminding her of tasks she should have been working on instead of this increasingly futile quest. Jaina knew that her position demanded that she deal with these other matters, but she rose from her chair and once more approached the trove of magical knowledge. Before she could make a decision, another voice overwhelmed the rest. Jaina, come quickly. Kalek. The contact broke, but not before she sensed from where he was calling. The location surprised her, but the Archmage did not hesitate. She exhaled and cast. Her arrival did not go as expected. She appeared not only many yards from where she had intended, but also more than a foot above the ground. The Archmage landed hard on her heels, the collision vibrating through her bones. Biting back an epithet worthy of her naval father, Jaina focused. Regaining her equilibrium, she surveyed the dark land before her, wondering why Kalek would call her to, of all places, the Dragonblight. Moreover, the Archmage wondered why he would summon her not from the temple, but from the shadows of the incredibly vast skeleton ahead. Jaina knew of the huge bones that had once been a behemoth called Galakrond, but there her knowledge faded into what myths and legends the aspects had passed along over the millennia. When they did speak of Galakrond, dragons made vague comments honoring him as the father of dragons. It was supposedly why so many of those dragons who came to die in the Dragonblight chose to set their bodies, if not facing Galakrond, then certainly in the vicinity of his skeleton. Jaina concentrated on Kalek, silently calling his name and awaiting a link with his mind. When that did not happen, she sharpened her call by directing it toward the monstrous ribcage. But although there came no answer, Jaina could not help feeling that the skeleton was where she needed to go. A fear abruptly arose in her that Kalek might now lie injured and unconscious, or even worse, somewhere within the half-buried bones. A haze draped over the region, making it impossible for the Archmage to see anything inside the ribs. She probed with her power, but found nothing. No. For just a moment, Jaina thought she sensed Kalek. Without hesitation, she transported herself nearer. This time the Archmage appeared where she desired. The ribs loomed over her. but of Kayla, there was still no sign. Jaina finally called his name. The only answer was the growing wind blowing through the bones. Aware that her destination had been this desolate place, using magic, she had shielded herself from the expected cold, and so the chill that ran down her spine had nothing to do with the elements. Despite that, though, the Archmage did not hesitate to enter. The moment she did, she sensed something else. A faint magical trace that reminded her of the artifact's aura.